6. New Haven County, Connecticut. The sky had cleared before nightfall, but the moon had not yet risen. The stars shed little light upon the cold earth. With his back against a boulder, Jack Twist sat in the snow atop a knoll at the edge of pines, waiting for the guardmaster armored truck to appear. Only 3 weeks after personally netting more than $1 million from the mafia warehouse job, he was already setting up another heist. He was wearing boots, gloves, and a white ski suit with the hood over his head and tied securely under his chin. 300 yards behind him and to the southwest, beyond the small woods, the darkness was relieved by the light of a housing development. However, Jack waited in utter blackness, his breath steaming. In front of him, 2 miles of night-clad fields lay northeast, barren but for a few widely spaced trees and some winter-strip brush. In the distance beyond the emptiness, there were electronics plants, then shopping centers, then residential neighborhoods, none of which was visible from Jack's position, though their existence was indicated by the glow of electric lights on the horizon. At the far edge of the fields, headlights appeared over a low rise. Raising a pair of night binoculars, Jack focused on the approaching vehicle, which was following the 2-lane county road that bisected the fields. In spite of the leftward cast of his left eye, Jack had superb vision, and with the help of the night binoculars, he ascertained that the vehicle was not the guardmaster truck, therefore of no consequence to him. He lowered the glasses. In his solitude upon the snowy knoll, he thought back to another time in a warmer place, to a humid night in a Central American jungle when he had studied a nocturnal landscape with binoculars just like these. Then he had been searching anxiously for hostile troops that had been stalking and encircling him and his buddies. His platoon, 20 highly trained rangers under the leadership of Lieutenant Rafe Eichhorn, with Jack as second in command, had crossed the border illegally and gone 15 miles inside the enemy state without being detected. Their presence could have been construed as an act of war. Therefore, they wore camouflage suits stripped of rank and service markings, and they carried no identification. Their target was a nasty little re-education camp, cynically named the Institute of Brotherhood, where 1,000 Mosquito Indians were imprisoned by the People's Army. 2 weeks earlier, courageous Catholic priests had led another 1,500 Indians through the jungles and out of the country before they could be imprisoned too. Those clergymen had brought word that the Indians at the Institute would be murdered and buried in mass graves if not rescued within the month. The Mosquitos were a fiercely proud breed with a rich culture that they refused to forsake for the anti-ethnic collectivist philosophy of the country's latest leaders. The Indians' continued loyalty to their own traditions would ensure their extermination, for the ruling council did not hesitate to call up the firing squads to solidify its power. Nevertheless, 20 rangers and mufti would not have been committed to such a dangerous raid merely to save Mosquitos. Both left and right-wing dictatorial regimes routinely slaughtered their citizenry in every corner of the world, and the United States could not prevent those state-sanctioned murders. But in addition to the Indians at the Institute, there were 11 others whose rescue, along with the Indians, made the risky operation worthwhile. Those 11 were former revolutionaries who had fought the just war against the now deposed right-wing dictator, but who had refused to remain silent when the revolution had been betrayed by totalitarians of the left. Undoubtedly, those 11 possessed valuable information. The opportunity to debrief them was more important than saving the lives of 1,000 Indians, at least as far as Washington was concerned. Undetected, Jack's platoon reached the Institute of Brotherhood in a farming district at the edge of the jungle. It was a concentration camp in all but name, a place of barbed wire fences and guard towers. 2 buildings stood outside the fence perimeter of the camp, a 2-story concrete block structure from which the government administered the district, and a dilapidated wooden barracks housing 60 troops. Shortly after midnight, the platoon of Rangers stealthily took up positions and launched a rocket attack on the barracks and the concrete building. The initial artillery barrages were followed by hand-to-hand combat. Half an hour after the last shot was fired, the Indians and other prisoners, as jubilant a group as Jack had ever seen, were formed into a column and moved out toward the border 15 miles away. 2 Rangers had been killed, 3 were wounded. As first in command of the platoon, Rafe Eichhorn led the exodus and oversaw security along the column's flanks, while Jack stayed behind with 3 men to be sure the last of the prisoners got out of the camp in orderly fashion. It was also his responsibility to gather up files relating to the interrogation, torture, and murder of Indians and district peasants. By the time he and his 4 men left the Institute of Brotherhood, they were 2 miles behind the last of the mosquitoes. Though Jack and his men made good time, they never caught up with their platoon and were still miles from the Honduran border when, at dawn, hostile army helicopters, like giant black wasps, came in low over the trees and began offloading enemy troops wherever a clearing could be found. The other Rangers and all the Indians reached freedom, but Jack and his 3 men were captured and transported to a facility similar to the Institute of Brotherhood. However, the place was so much worse than the concentration camp that it had no official existence. The ruling council did not admit that such a hellhole existed in the new workers' paradise, or that monstrous inquisitions were conducted within its walls. In true Orwellian tradition, because the 4-story complex of cells and torture chambers had no name, it did not exist. Within those nameless walls and cells without numbers, Jack Twist and the 3 other Rangers were subjected to psychological and physical torture, relentless humiliation and degradation, controlled starvation, and constant threats of death. 1 of the 4 died. 1 went mad. Only Jack and his closest friend, Oscar Weston, held on to both life and sanity during the 11.5 months of their incarceration. Now, 8 years later, leaning against a boulder atop a knoll in Connecticut, waiting for the guardmaster truck, Jack heard sounds and detected odors which were not of this windswept winter night. The hard footfalls of jack boots on concrete corridors, the stench from the overflowing slops bucket, which was the cell's only toilet, the pathetic cry of some poor bastard being taken from his cell to another session with interrogators. Jack took deep breaths of the clean, cold Connecticut air. He was seldom troubled by bad memories of that time and nameless place. He was more often haunted by what had happened to him after his escape, and by what had happened to his Jenny in his absence. It was not his suffering in Central America that turned him against society. Rather, subsequent events were what had soured him. He saw other headlights out in the black fields and raised his night binoculars. It was the Guardmaster Armored Transport. He looked at his watch, 9:38. It was right on schedule, as it had been every night for a week. Even with the holiday tomorrow, the truck kept to its route. Guardmaster security was nothing if not reliable. On the ground beside Jack was an attaché case. He lifted the lid. The blue numerals of a digital scanner were locked on the guardmaster's open radio link to the company dispatcher. Even with his state-of-the-art equipment, he had needed 3 nights to discover the truck's frequency. He turned the volume dial on his own receiver. Static crackled, hissed. Then he was rewarded by a routine exchange between the driver and the distant dispatcher. 301, the dispatcher said. Reindeer, the driver said. Rudolph, the dispatcher said. Rooftop, the driver said. The hiss and crackle of static settled in once more. The dispatcher had opened the exchange with the truck's number, and the rest of it had been the day's code, which served as confirmation that 301 was on schedule and in no trouble of any kind. Jack switched off his receiver. The lighted dials went dark. The armored transport passed less than 200 feet from his position on the knoll, and he turned to watch its dwindling taillights. He was confident of Guardmaster 301's schedule now, and he would not be returning to these fields until the night of the stick-up, which was tentatively scheduled for Saturday, January 11th. Meanwhile, there was a great deal more planning to be done. Ordinarily, planning a job was nearly as exciting and satisfying as the actual commission of the crime. But as he left the knoll and headed toward the houses to the southwest, where he had parked his car in a quiet street, he felt no elation, no thrill. He was losing the ability to take delight in even the contemplation of a crime. He was changing, and he did not know why. As he drew near the first houses to the southwest of the knoll, he became aware that the night had grown brighter. He looked up. The moon swelled fat on the horizon, so huge it seemed to be crashing to earth, an illusion of enormousness created by the odd perspective of the early stages of the satellite's ascension. He stopped abruptly and stood with his head tilted back, staring up at the luminous lunar surface. A chill seized him, an inner iciness unrelated to the winter cold. "The moon," he said softly. Hearing himself speak those words aloud, Jack shuddered violently. Inexplicable fear welled in him. He was gripped by an irrational urge to run and hide from the moon, as if its luminescence were corrosive and would, like an acid, dissolve him as he stood bathed in it. The compulsion to flee passed in a minute. He could not understand why the moon had so suddenly terrified him. It was only the ancient and familiar moon of love songs and romantic poetry. Strange. He headed toward the car again. The looming lunar face still made him uneasy, and several times he glanced up at it, perplexed. However, by the time he got in the car, drove into New Haven, and picked up Interstate 95, that curious incident had faded from his mind. He was once more preoccupied with thoughts of Jenny, his comatose wife, whose condition haunted him more than usual at Christmas time. Later, in his apartment, as he stood by a big window, staring out at the great city, a bottle of Beck's in one hand, he was sure that from 261st Street to Park Row, from Bensonhurst to Little Neck, there could be no one in the metropolis whose Christmas Eve was lonelier than his.